Good morning. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be at the conference to give these presentations in person, but I hope you will still enjoy them. The first area I'm going to talk about is training, fitness, performance, and injury in horses. Next slide, please. There are three different components to training. One is skill development. This is very clear in sports such as dressage. There is also psychological training of horses to prepare them, their mind to cope with competition. And the third area, of course, is physical training. This is training that is used to increase fitness. And next slide, please. In this talk, I'm going to concentrate purely on physical training. Next slide, please. Why do we train horses? Well, there's two main reasons. The first is that we know fitter horses have a higher level of performance. And secondly, training should reduce the risk of injury. Fitter horses should be at less risk of injury than unfit horses. Next slide, please. There are many different factors that determine the performance of a horse in a race. Of course, it's training, whether it has an injury, it's nutrition, it's breeding, it's genetics. But of course, also the driver, the decisions the driver makes in a race have a very big impact on performance. Next slide, please. And many people will say that breeding and genetics is everything in racing, but actually two different scientific studies showed that genetics or breeding only accounts for about 30 to 40% of performance in trotters. Next slide, please. And even training is maybe not does not have such a big impact as many people think. In fact, we know from many different studies that training only improves performance by around 10 to 15%. Next slide, please. What is the biggest challenge in getting horses fit to race? Well, in any sport, and including in trotters, the biggest problem is going to be keeping horses sound, preventing lameness. Next slide, please. If we look at studies that have been done in thoroughbreds, for example, we see that 78% of fractures in thoroughbred racehorses in the UK occurred in training, not in racing. And we know where these fractures typically occur. Obviously, in thoroughbred racing, the horses are usually a lot younger than in those used in trotting. But we still see, as I say, that the majority of the injuries occur in training, not in racing. Next slide, please. So we have to ask the question as to why training results in so many musculoskeletal injuries. Next slide, please. Again, we know that surfaces play a very important role in determining the rate of injury. Very hard surfaces that do not have the right the right angle, the right banking, surfaces that are uneven. These all increase the risk of injury, and we know that trotting tracks are relatively firm. They are not as soft as grass, and we know that the hardness of the track is an issue in terms of lameness. Next slide, please. And when we wonder why so many injuries occur to the lower legs, we know this is because the lower leg of the horse has very little muscle, very little protection. The limbs, the feet hit the ground very hard, they hit the ground very fast. The bones are relatively fine, and the limbs are moving very fast as well. So all these factors help explain why injuries to the lower legs are very common. Next slide, please. In the past 30 years, we have seen many developments in things that should help with training and should help reduce injury. We have seen changes in track surface, changes in nutrition, new methods for diagnosing injury, new drugs. But we still see a lot of injuries, and it tends to be the same type of injuries that we were seeing 30 years ago. So in spite of all these changes, we still have a lot of injury. Next slide, please. So why are injuries still very common? Well, it could be the horses, it could be the drivers, it could be the trainers, the surfaces. There are lots of different explanations, but I don't believe that these are the real cause. Next slide, please. The one thing that is very clear, we know that horses, wild horses and horses that are being used for sport do very different things. A wild horse and a domesticated horse, such as a horse, a trotter, may be covering the same distance in a week, but the way they cover that distance is very different. So in the wild, horses mainly walk. They do a little bit of trot, a little bit of canter, but of course the domesticated horse being trained to compete does mainly trot and mainly maybe some canter and gallop. So the speeds are much higher. Next slide, please. There's another reason why training may be difficult and why training may result in so many injuries. And this is because different body systems require different amounts of training. Next slide, please. So the tendons, the skeleton, and the joints require actually very little training, and they are often overtrained. They are often injured. Whereas at the other end, we have the heart and the muscles, and these require a lot of training, and these are often undertrained, but they have a lower risk of injury. Next slide, please. The one thing that may surprise you is that the respiratory system, the lungs, do not improve as a result of training. Now, there are a lot of myths about this, but we have a number of different studies, good scientific studies, which show that the respiratory system does not change with training. And part of that is related to the fact that the breathing and stride are related. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about science of training horses. How much is there? Actually, there is a huge amount. Over 2,000 papers related to training of horses. Now, of course, not all of these are about training trotters, but the principles that apply to training racehorses or to training thoroughbred racehorses or to training event horses, endurance horses, the basic principles apply whatever type of horse we're talking about. Next slide, please. One of the interesting things we know is that how often you train your horse and how hard has an effect on fitness. So if you were to train Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 3 days in a row and not train for another 4 days, this would not be very effective. It would be better to train on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Saturday if you were going to do 3 sessions rather than to have them all together. Of course, many horses in racing are trained for 6 days and then maybe have 1 day rest. Next slide, please. But the horse has no idea that the week lasts 7 days. Often our training organisation is made to fit around what is best for people, not necessarily what is best for the horse. So having 2 hard days followed by 1 lighter day, having 2 hard days followed by another lighter day. Alternative types of training may actually be better for the horse, may result in better fitness and may result actually in less lameness. Next slide, please. One of the real important principles of training from a scientific view is that when you start to train horses when they're unfit, they increase their fitness very quickly. But as you get them fitter and fitter, you have to put in more and more work to get the same out. So the horse that is close to racing does not benefit as much from work as the horse that is unfit. Now, next slide, please. The problem also is that as you reach for that little bit more fitness as the horse gets closer to the race, you also tend to see an increased risk of injury. Next slide, please. So how much do races actually contribute to fitness? Well, many people believe that they are important, but I would argue differently. If you think of 3 months training and you think of having 6 sessions a week and those sessions last for 60 minutes, then you are looking at 72 hours of training. Now, if you look also at, say, one race, maybe on a race day your horse is working for 1 hour with the warm-up and the race itself. So you have 72 hours of training versus 1 hour of competing. I would argue that the thing that makes the biggest effect on your horse's performance is the 72 hours of training, not the 1 hour of the race. So races are not for getting horses fit unless you are doing 2 or 3 races a week, in which case you maybe then don't need to do any training. Next slide, please. But what races are for, of course, is finding out how fit your horse is, how good your training is, and how good your driving is. Next slide, please. There is obviously a lot more information about the training of human athletes than there is about the training of horses. So is there anything that we can learn from the training of human athletes? Next slide, please. If we look at any training programs for horses, they are often something like this. So the training increases over the number of weeks and the horses are trained harder and longer the closer you get to the race. Now, if we look at, next slide please, how a human athlete might train, it can look very different. So the things that you will notice here is that after every sort of 3 or 4 weeks, the training intensity is reduced, and these are called recovery weeks. Now, by dropping the intensity down for a week, this allows small injuries that may have been developing to recover and can prevent them from progressing to more serious injuries. The other interesting thing that is very different is when you look at the preparation at the end in weeks 19 to 21, you start to see what's called tapering being used, and I will explain tapering later on in the talk. But tapering is effectively a technique to improve performance going into competition. Next slide, please. So we can see that if we look at we compare the human training program in blue to the horse typical training program in red, we can see that they look very different. And there is a lot of science behind this to support the human training approach. Next slide. Now, I mentioned tapering. Tapering is a form of preparing for a race, which involves keeping up the same intensity of training. So for a trotter, that would be doing the same speeds, but over the week leading into the race, you would actually do less distance, less time at those speeds. So your amount of daily exercise reduces as you come up to the race. Now next slide. This has been shown to do in human athletes very clearly in many different studies is improve performance. Next slide, please. So why does tapering improve performance? Well, it mainly relates to the storage of energy within the muscle. If you think of the main energy source that the trotter uses during racing is what's called glycogen. Now, glycogen is lots of glucose sugars linked together, and that is the equivalent of starch in plants. After tapering, the amount of glycogen stored in the muscle is increased, and increased glycogen gives you more energy, more power during the race. Next slide, please. So tapering increases muscle energy stores. It also allows the damage that occurs to muscle during training to repair, because even a healthy trotter, every time it exercises, will do some small damage to the muscles. Now, the combination of allowing the muscles to repair and increasing the energy store has a significant effect on muscle performance. Next slide, please. Now, there is a lot of science about tapering in human sport, over 110 papers. There is only one paper on tapering in horses, and that was actually done with standardbred trotters. And they showed that if horses were tapered for 7 days going into a race, then they ran 4.4% faster peak speed, and their average speed was 2.4% faster, which, as any of you will know, is a really, really big improvement in performance over the course of a race for a horse to run 2.4% faster. We're talking, 3 or 4 seconds perhaps faster. So tapering is certainly something I would consider looking at, because many people will do hard exercise a few days before a race in the belief that this opens the airways up. It really doesn't. There is no evidence to suggest hard exercise improves the respiratory function. What it does is use up energy stores and cause more damage to the muscles. So I strongly recommend that you have a consideration of tapering, and perhaps try it on a horse that isn't performing as well as you'd like, or a horse that you think is as fit as you can get it, but is still not able to win a race. It's worth trying to see if you can improve performance on a horse like this. Next slide, please. So how do I understand how hard I'm training my horse? Because this is the key. You want to make sure your horse is working hard enough. Many different things affect this. So the faster you go, obviously, the harder the horse works. The longer you drive for, the harder the horse works. If the surface is soft, if the surface is very wet, then the horse is working harder. If it's a hot day. So many different things affect how hard the horse is working. And of course genetics as well, because some horses are genetically more talented, more athletic than others. So at the end of the day, it can be very difficult to know, even if two horses do the same exercise, the same training, one could be working 10-15% harder than the other because of some of these factors. The only way to really know how hard you're working your horse is to use a heart rate monitor. And I know that in trotting, these are used by a lot of drivers. But this would be, to talk about the use of heart rate would be a whole nother talk. Next slide, please. So what can we learn that would be simple things that may help improve your horse's fitness, reduce injury, and give better performance? Some studies that have been done in other sports and in thoroughbred training suggest that using a variety of different surfaces to train on can actually reduce the risk of injury compared to always using the same surface. We know that surfaces that are uneven or surfaces that change quite suddenly also increase the risk of injury. Most horses are not undertrained, they are actually overtrained, so they are doing more exercise than they actually need to, and this results in injuries. One really simple thing that you can do to improve performance is to use tapering. Remember, this is reducing the distance you do each day in the week leading into a race, but you actually keep doing the same speeds. You just do less distance. If you have horses that you have a problem with injury, consider using a different pattern of training. For example, perhaps instead of 6 days training, 1 day rest, you may look at 3 days training, 1 day rest, 3 days training, 1 day rest, etc. And again, the real key is to make sure every training session counts, is to use a heart rate monitor. Thank you very much. I hope this has been useful, and I believe later on we're going to try and take some questions. Thank you.